I am pleased for the last time in this conference to introduce our final keynote speaker, and that would be our president, David Nalley, who will be giving the annual State of the Foundation address. So everyone welcome David.
So I hate to disappoint you, but Brian stole a lot of my thunder in his comments. He told you that it was the 25th year the foundation's been around. He told you about how large and successful we are. So on the teleprompter, can you go to minute 5, and we can skip all of the preamble stuff there.
Helping.
Incredibly helpful. I appreciate the teaser. So the foundation's been around since 1999. And frankly, it looks a lot different than it did then. I wasn't around in 1999. I've only been at the foundation for 13 years. And so a lot of my context comes from looking at effectively the archaeological record of the foundation, which is our mailing list. And being so email-centric has meant that we have a long-standing record for folks to be able to go look at. And I had the chance to have breakfast this morning with Ruth Seeley, who's the Executive Vice President of the Foundation. And we were talking about just how much things had changed, even in our short tenure at the Foundation, and how much open source has changed. And so I want to set just a little bit of context. In 1999, believe it or not, open source was not ubiquitous. A lot of people who were involved in open source software were kind of seen as these weirdos. You know, some people called them hippies, others called them socialists. There was no understanding of why they wanted to give away software. And a lot of the people involved in open source were really just looking to try and solve problems that they had. And they found that they could work together and solve them more quickly than they could alone. And we're actually having a fun time doing so. And in 1999, there were some things that were kind of difficult. Having a website was not as trivial as it is today. Frankly, having an internet connection wasn't as easy either. And so having a website, having a mailing list, having a bug tracker, those were all tremendous benefits that the early days of the foundation provided to the projects, especially after we got past just the web server. And so, when we go back and look, in the early days of the foundation, we were solving problems for open source projects and making it easier for them to focus on writing software and shipping releases. Over time, as that started to become easier to do on your own, you could go get something on SourceForge or GitHub or Google Code back in the day. You could get access to things like bug trackers and websites and code hosting repositories. A lot of the inspection started to become, hey, a lot of people are using this, but we're still primarily concerned about IP risk. And the foundation changed a little bit and started to have a lot more robust models for how it thought about intellectual property. We had a clearinghouse for intellectual property and code grants that were coming into the foundation. We were thinking very actively about patents, and you'll see, obviously, in version 2 of the Apache Software license, we have an explicit patent grant. So from very early days, thinking about how we needed to act and model our projects, and ultimately, one of the most widely adopted licenses in the world for open source is the Apache Software license, because we were taking this look across the public that was consuming us and saying, what are they concerned about? And so we have the concerns about intellectual property, and obviously we want robust policies there because lawyers can be a friction on software adoption, right? If a lawyer doesn't understand the license or is not comfortable with the risk, they'll slow things down. And one of the values, particularly for users, for open source software is that they can adopt it quickly. They can adopt it with very little overhead. They don't have to engage finance. They don't have to engage, in most cases, they don't have to engage legal counsel to do a license review, because over time, we've gotten those folks comfortable with the idea that these licenses are well known, well understood, and have stood the test of time. And by having a robust policy for not just the software that we write, but the software that we ingest as dependencies and that we ship with our projects, we made people very comfortable with consuming Apache projects themselves, because when a lawyer came and started to inspect the chain of how things happen, we say, oh, well, we have very clear software grant agreements that's processed by a secretary of the foundation. We have very clear provenance tracking, and it goes into a code repository, and we've got this archive of all of the steps that happened in email. And let me tell you, we get subpoenas on a regular basis asking for those records for various litigation purposes. And having that started to make people comfortable. And so Apache, as a brand, started to transform from just being a place where people come and work on interesting open source projects into effectively, and I apologize, I recognize this is a US-based idiom, the good housekeeping seal of approval. In Europe, you might have the CE mark or some of the other designations elsewhere. Essentially, it's a stamp saying, hey, this has really high quality standards, and a lot of that was around intellectual property. In the past decade or so, we've seen an increasing focus on security. And that's not really new to open source. We've always known that software is written by humans and is going to have mistakes, and that some of those mistakes are going to be security issues. And just out of curiosity, how many people got to participate in the tabletop exercise? Okay. So to give you an idea of how important this is, the US federal government volunteered to come and work a tabletop exercise because they believe that strengthening security is really important, and they wanted to make that investment in Apache's software developer community. And we've had offers of doing that from other governments as well. They certainly want to help us because they have realized that software is ubiquitous. We'll talk about that ubiquity in a minute. But right around the time that Heartbleed, which was a vulnerability in an encryption library called OpenSSL, when Heartbleed broke, the world realized that, wow, everything has open source in it. We need to care about open source. In the industry, in the software industry, we started seeing open source program offices move from the legal department to the Chief Information Security Officer's organization, marking a shift from the thing we care about now or the riskiest thing is not necessarily IP risk, still something that concerns companies, but it's now a security risk. And we're no stranger to this type of concern. Log4Shell, which was a vulnerability in the Apache logging project's Log4j package, certainly drew a lot of eyeballs. And to my knowledge, it's the most widely publicized, heavily written about vulnerability in open source software to date. And For better or worse, I got to have lots of interactions with regulators and legislators and congressional appointees to cabinet agencies and talk to them about how Apache was thinking about security and listen to their concerns, and frankly, they were incredulous. They could not understand how something that was put together by what we had been using in terms of language, volunteers, because we talk about volunteers. Brian told you how we're the largest volunteer-led foundation on the planet. Stole an entire paragraph out of my speech. But he told you that, and this is the last time I let him look at my speaker notes. So, they're sitting there going, how are these volunteers? And they're imagining someone sitting in a basement or someone who has to go to a coffee shop because they can't afford their own internet connection, being the group that assembles software and puts it all together, and then the entire world consumes it. And they are inferring from this, because we're using coded language like volunteers, that makes sense to us in our particular environment. But to them translates to someone who's unemployed, who can't get a job, who's not a professional software developer and is not qualified to write software. And they're properly freaking out because they are starting to understand just how broadly open source is deployed. And frankly, it shocked me too. I've been working in open source for almost 2 decades, and I was surprised by just how ubiquitous it was. When the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the US started making a list of where's Log4j deployed? Where isn't is a good question. And I guess if you're not, if there's no Java on the device or in the stack, maybe you don't have Log4j. But otherwise, you probably have at least one copy of Log4j in any given piece of software that's running. And we were seeing things like, hey, there's some satellites that are currently orbiting that have Log4j. I never thought that the James Bond type thing where they take over a satellite was going to be enabled by the Apache Software Foundation. But apparently that's, we're making the movies come true. The phlebotomy machines. I didn't even think that there's software there. It's primarily a hardware device, and it's doing mechanical things, and apparently Log4j is there as well. But I say all of that to say that I think, I talked about how the foundation has shifted a number of times from providing the really basic necessities, providing a place that people can come collaborate, worried about intellectual property as the concerns around open source shifted to that, pivoting to worrying about security, so we're having to add another layer, right? We can't stop the intellectual property work. We have to continue with that, and we also have to start working on security. And I think that the Apache Software Foundation has this tremendous reputation. And I want to talk about that reputation in two facets. The first is, people trust us because we have been doing really high quality, really obsessively tracking intellectual property, having a known security process for incident response, and people know what they're going to get. We have appropriately set expectations as a foundation, and so people trust the Apache Software Foundation. If you've got a top-level project here, people know that they can trust it and that someone's paying attention, that it's well-maintained. One of the things that I think is the most crucial actions of the foundation's board is terminating the project, moving it to the attic. Because that is a signal to the public that, hey, you can't trust this anymore. Might be great software, there might be people who care about it and use it, but no one's actively maintaining it, or there's not enough people to actively maintain it. I had the opportunity to go to the United Nations earlier this year, and I told a hall of diplomats that we didn't allow single maintainer projects at the Apache Software Foundation. And there was shock. And that shouldn't be shock, but certainly shouldn't shock people here in the Apache environment, because we all know that there are some minimums that the foundation expects in terms of number of people paying attention, number of people who are able to release software. Are they able to respond timely to security issues? We understand that. But open source has received so much fear that people, the diplomats who've been hearing that open source is both great and also very dangerous, were shocked. And a number of people came up to me and said, hey, tell me more about these requirements. What's the minimum threshold that you have to have? And I said, well, you know, the minimum that we think, the absolute minimum, is that we need 3 people. We need 3 people who are paying attention to the code coming in, 3 people who are voting on releases, 3 people who can respond to a security incident, and that's the bare minimum. And that's not the bare minimum for all projects. That is the absolute bare minimum. Some projects are a lot more complicated, larger, and that complexity demands that they're actually going to need more people. And so I entertained a lot of the hallway conversations from diplomats and staff from diplomatic missions, where they were like, tell us more about this. We had no idea that there was this. We've heard that Apache's, you know, one of the preeminent foundations, but you actually having this standard and being able to tell us about it reassures us so much more, because we're hearing, we've seen the XKCD comic that tells us about this person in Nebraska that the entire world is going to collapse because of. And I said, that's a real problem in open source. There are really poor libraries that I can think of where there's 1 or 2 people in the world who know how to build it and ship a release, who have access to ship a release. And that's scary. But that is not true for projects at the Apache Software Foundation. And so holding that bar really high on the quality, the security, the intellectual property has earned a lot of trust in the environment. And the foundation really does, I say, it's a shortcut for trust. This is somewhat true of all foundations, right? So if you've been paying attention to tech news, you've seen a number of software projects that were licensed under an open source license that have changed their license to something that takes away freedoms from the users and is not in compliance with the open source definition. That's a risk. There's a lot of projects out there, some right now that are in the news, undergoing some controversy because one party is trying to exert more control over the project and effectively acting as a dictator inside the project, determining the future direction of that project. Foundations are a place that people trust because they have an underlying mission that's different. The Apache Software Foundation's mission is to release software free of charge for public good. We are a public benefit charity, and that has some interesting implications. We do not exist for open source. Open source developers are not our core mission. Nor are the companies that sponsor us. We do not exist to benefit the companies who give us money. Apple, for instance, who so graciously is a sponsor here, we don't exist to drive outcomes for Apple. We don't exist to drive outcomes for open source projects. We exist and have a legal obligation to make the world a better place. We have to make sure that our actions benefit the public at large. Most of the time, what benefits an open source project or developers on the project also lines up with public good. But at the end of the day, every one of our actions has to line up with, is this in the public's best interest? And so we have a legal obligation that essentially allows people to trust us transitively and allows people to trust our projects transitively. You might have seen some recent controversy around projects at the Apache Software Foundation where venture capital money has come in or acquisitions have happened. And people are all worried about who actually controls that project now. Is it the company who just dropped millions or billions of dollars? And the reality is that we have very robust governance systems, and that is one of the things that we provide as a mechanism of trust to the public. When something carries the Apache brand, people know that that means there's going to be governance by consensus. It's the project management committee. It's supposed to be the people who are acting in their capacity as an individual, not as a representative of some other organization. And that has tremendous value and has earned us tremendous trust in this ecosystem. But I want to talk about what's coming next. And I promise I'll be quiet soon. Brian has told me he's happy to come up and deliver my last couple of minutes just to get me off the stage. But it is tempting, isn't it? He could probably do it better than I can. But things are changing again. We're seeing increased inspection from governments who have now woken up and realized that everything that they've built from a technological standpoint is built on open source, and they're scared about that. They're scared because it's not something that they can control within a single country's borders. They're scared because outside of events like this, most of us don't know the people that we're interacting with. I talked with someone last night who has been working with someone in open source for years now. They're collaborating on a project. They have never physically met in person, never been in the same space. And that's kind of a norm for open source. And so governments are taking that as you don't know who you're working with, you don't know what their purpose is. Boy, this would be a lot simpler if you could just hire and fire open source developers. And so that has led, along with some of the security concerns, to folks wanting to start to regulate open source. And I think that's going to change. I think we're at an inflection point. The foundation's 25 years old. We have hundreds of projects. We are one of the largest foundations, depending upon which measure you measure that by. We're typically either number one or number two in terms of either impact or number of projects or lines of code. And that's great, but also it means that people are looking to us to address the future. And just like in 1999 when we provided a website, a mailing list, and a bug tracker, and along with CDS, the things that got us going in 1999 are not going to be the things that will take us into the future. I think we are at an inflection point. I certainly never imagined having my photo in the Wall Street Journal or testifying before Congress as a software developer. Certainly not about open source. But the world has taken notice, and I think the world's changing around us. And I think there are going to have to be some changes that the foundation tackles in fundamental ways that we operate, because we have an obligation to operate in the best interest of the general public. And so I'm going to tell you a couple of those things, and I promise I'll shut up, because I know you have other things to go attend. You got some great tracks. I really wish I could go sit in on the data engineering track. But we're seeing people want us to tell them how we did it. They want to expect how, because they don't trust us today. They recognize that they're forced to, but they don't want to trust what we're providing today. They want to know how something was built, where it was built, where we got all of the components that are dependencies in our build chain. They want to know, is this actually the thing that was really built? What's the collection of things that are here together? What's your building materials? And a lot of those are kind of disruptive to the way that we've operated because at the foundation, it's a relatively high trust environment. Saw Eric here a minute ago. Yeah, in the back. You know, Eric and I talked a lot over the internet for many years, and it was years before we actually met. But we have a high trust relationship already. And the foundation and our projects tend to operate on this high trust medium where we work together, we learn each other over the internet, and we get things done, we ship software, and nobody's running a background check on me or Eric. And I think that's the way we want open source to continue. But that's scary people. And they want inspection. They want to know who built this. Where was it built? Tell me about the environment it was built in. And so while we have earned a lot of trust in many areas like intellectual property and licensing and even that we're going to have a number of people working on a project, there are people who want us to earn more trust by being even more transparent than we are today. And so I think that as we are looking as a foundation, I'm not talking about the projects themselves right now, but as a foundation, our challenge is we need to recognize that the world is rapidly changing around us, whether it's the CRA coming out of Europe, the Cyber Resiliency Act, the Product Liability Directive coming out of Europe, some of the things happening in the United States. I was getting briefed a couple of weeks ago on some regulations coming out of Latin America that are going to impact open source. We need to be thinking about how do we meet those challenges as a foundation group and make it easy for our products. I know I said that word, products. That's the thing that consumers actually take possession of, right? We have projects, and they produce code, and that code is often the product that we're shipping. Because the entire world does not see us as an open source foundation with a bunch of open source projects who work on code. They see us as a corporation shipping products to the world, and that our products are entering the market. And so our challenge as a foundation is going to be, how do we recognize that these concerns exist? What is in the best interest of the public? And how do we make it easy for our projects to meet those expectations? The foundation itself does not exist to write software. We don't employ developers. That's really not our mission per se. We obviously want to ship a lot of software, but we're not involved in the writing of it ourselves. Our mission is really to benefit the public. And so to do that in our particular medium, we're going to have to figure out what is the easiest way for our projects to deal with the new constraints, to meet the regulatory requirements, to earn back the trust or earn that same level of trust we have in other spaces in this new world. I think that's a big challenge for us. I think it's going to change the way that we operate. I think it's going to be painful for the foundation. My goal is that it not be painful for the projects, but as we have to learn how to operate in new ways, we need to make sure that we're focused on making it as easy as possible for the projects that call the foundation a home to meet those new expectations and still be able to ship high quality, well secured, clean intellectual property provenance software on a regular basis. I'm excited though, because despite this challenge, despite the fact that it's going to break lots of traditions that we probably hold a little too dear. I think the foundation is going to respond to this, and to respond well. We're working right now with the Eclipse Foundation on figuring out how we can practically address the concerns of the Cyber Resiliency Act. We are literally setting the standard by which open source is going to be judged under this new regulation right now. And I'm excited to say that, you know, when we're looking at the requirements, a lot of our existing security incident response properties that the security team has put in place, they line up pretty well with those expectations. There's going to be a lot of new things we have to do, a lot of new work we're going to have to do. Merle, our VP of Infrastructure, is working on finding someone to do some tooling work to help accelerate this so we have less manual processes and we can automate and make some of these more onerous things just happen automatically. But I think we are going to have to step up and recognize that we cannot continue to do the things that we have done for many years in the same way that we did them 25 years ago. I appreciate your patience in listening to me. I'm sorry that I was not as amazing a delivery as Brian was with my first two paragraphs worth of content. But I appreciate you coming here and investing your time in the foundation. I truly believe that the Apache Software Foundation is one of the most impactful places in open source today. It's not the only place. There's lots of other places doing good work. But this particular foundation, the projects at this foundation, have literally changed the face of the ecosystem and set a standard that the rest of the industry is moving to try and copy. So thank you for coming and investing your time, because this community is the community that gets things done in the foundation. I get a nice fancy title and I get to come up on stage, but I'm not actually doing the bulk of the work. It's other people who are doing that. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. I look forward to hopefully getting to spend time with folks here. And I want to call out a special thanks to Brian and the other organizers of this conference. It's amazing that they're able to take us to interesting places all over the world and bring us together, and we get to hang out in person. I can't tell you how valuable that is in terms of building relationships. And as an aside, I've made some lifelong friends at Apache conferences. I will say I was bamboozled at least once at an Apache conference. I sat down as a contributor to a single project and was talking about some things that I was interested in working on. And Rich Bowen said, "You know what? I think you should get involved in infrastructure." And I went from working on a single project at the Apache Software Foundation and not having any concept of how the rest of the foundation worked to getting involved and maybe going a little too far down the rabbit hole. I don't know how I ended up here. So it's a little confusing because every time I turned around, Rich was like, "You know, you could get involved in this and do this other thing." So I told his wife earlier that I was enabling him to buy pens because he enabled me to spend a lot of time working on the Apache Software Foundation. But it's been a wonderful, rewarding experience. I think there's a lot of opportunities for people to get involved past a single project. And I hope you take this time to talk to the other folks who are here involved at the foundation. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.